looking like preach.
Hello, and welcome to the Anexinet Infrastructure Modernization Podcast. Here on AIM, we invite industry professionals and subject matter experts on to discuss current trends and technology topics. Today, we are going to be talking about the Tech Data Grant Support Program with Terry Walsh. Terry is a SLED Solutions Architect with TD Synnex. Terry, how are you doing today?
Great, Chris. Thanks for allowing me to participate today.
Another additional special guest from Anexinet is Account Executive Terry Noriega. Other Terry, how are you doing today?
Very good, sir. Very excited about the new program we have to offer and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
And of course, co-host Dave Mahoney is back again, Enterprise Solutions Architect with Anexinet. Dave, how's it going?
It's going. Hello, everybody.
All right. Thank you all for joining today. In order to get us started, Terry Walsh, can you just tell us two things? First of all, can we establish what the SLED market is and then how the grant program supports that market?
Yeah, sure, Chris. So, we all throw around these acronyms in public sector and sometimes forget that maybe not everyone understands them. So SLED, state, local, and education. And so anything from state government, local government, and really under that banner, public safety. So there's a lot of different entities in this state and local government vertical. And then, of course, on the education side, generally speaking, K-12 and higher ed, but also research institutions and the like. So that's the SLED market as we recognize it, and different people define it differently. Sometimes there's public healthcare that's included in a SLED market. So there is some variability on how it gets defined. But in my role here at TD Synnex, as a SLED market specialist, really looking at what is going on in the SLED market space. And we really want to touch on the state of affairs, if you will, as it relates to grants when it comes to the COVID response that the federal government has, really taken on over the last year or 20 months, I guess, at this point. So before COVID hit, of course, there's a lot of federal grants, as everyone knows, that are available year in and year out. But we also know that the clients, in many cases, are challenged to get their arms around the availability of the grants, understanding which ones they might qualify for to fund their IT projects, and ultimately how to go access those funds. The grant application sometimes can be very laborious. We know in many cases the clients may not be fully staffed to have a full-time resource to go after the grants. And so that landscape, even pre-COVID, is pretty challenging. So then you fast forward to March 2020, of course, COVID rears its ugly head. Fortunately, the federal government took swift action and released the CARES funding, which you may all be familiar with, that came out in March of 2020. And so that funding became quickly available in the market space. And then through the course of calendar 2020, we had the Consolidated Appropriations Act, an additional grant related to COVID that came out in December of 2020. And then in 2021, of course, the American Rescue Plan. Those three stimulus packages combined total $5 trillion of funding. And so, by the way, we know that's not all technology funding, but a lot of it is related to technology. But you add this layer of complexity, these additional three stimulus packages, into an already complex grant landscape, and it can seem overwhelming for many clients. You have overlapping timelines, overlapping expiration dates, different stimulus packages were funding different parts of the SLED market space, and sometimes the qualifiers and the types of projects were being funded varied as well. And so our program was really designed to help our resellers in the channel, strategic resellers like Anexinet, work with the client to help them demystify this entire landscape. And so we've launched it as of July 1. We've had great success with it, and happy to explore that in more detail as we go along here, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that overview. The first point I want to highlight is the market of SLED is really a little bit larger than probably a lot of organizations understand, right? It's not just Division I colleges. There's a much wider net that these grants can be applied to.
There's any number of different verticals or sub-verticals. As an example, if you look at the different primary verticals, so state and local government, higher education, K-12, and then if you drill down into each of those verticals, there, of course, you think of nonprofit colleges and universities in healthcare, or excuse me, in the higher ed sector. But don't forget about research collaboratives or technical colleges that are out there. State and local government, same thing. Of course, you know the local courthouse and the state government and those entities that we all think about. But then there's fire and EMS. There's human services department, public libraries, cultural institutions, housing authorities. So really thinking about the totality of the types of agencies that would be ideal candidates for much of this funding that has been made available.
Yeah, Terry, and other thing that we're seeing a pretty big explosion of too is, and you hit upon it as well, as healthcare. You don't realize how many nonprofit healthcare organizations are actually out there. And it's not really the size of the healthcare either. I mean, we're seeing the funding come through for, 50 seat employees up to, 2,000 seat employees. So the funding is available for everyone, and everybody should be taking advantage of it. One other thing that we should touch upon too is the time frame of the grants. You touched upon, how monotonous it can be to actually have the grant crafted and created, but also receiving the funds for the grant. Can you kind of touch upon how that's been expedited and what the federal government has done there?
Yeah, that's a great point, Terry. So in the traditional non-COVID grant landscape, it's been our experience that from the time that the grant funding and program is announced through to the award, usually runs between 24 and 48 weeks. And as they say, your mileage may vary, but it's an extended timeline for these non-traditional, or I should say non-COVID related grants. The good news is with the stimulus funding, we've seen a significant acceleration in that cycle time from when the grant is announced to the award, more like 6 to 20 weeks. And really, that was one of the primary design points from the federal government is make the money available and get it into the hands of the clients as quickly as possible, knowing that the clients are challenged with, distance learning, telemedicine, and all these other solutions and citizen, student, and patient services that they're trying to deliver. So good news is we've got significant investment from the federal government and an accelerated timeline to get access to some of the stimulus funding.
One other thing we should kind of touch upon too is, and you're kind of glazing over the beauty of the program, I think, of doing the research for the grants. Can you kind of step through just a quick process of how we get the customer engaged and what that process looks like from start to finish?
Sure, happy to do that. So with our program and working again with strategic partners like Anexinet, we initiate with a very short information gathering process to identify what the client is looking to solve for. There's 4 key attributes to be able to create a funding report. So the first is, who is the end user? What is the entity that is looking for funding? Where are they located? These 2 items are important because the funding for K-12 is different than the funding for a regionally based hospital or a higher ed or state government, of course. Where the entity is located, because in many cases, the funding is flowing down through the governor, and the governor is allocating the funds how she or he sees fit. So one governor investing more heavily in K-12, another governor perhaps investing more heavily in public safety as an example. So as we go through this process of collecting the client information, who is the client, what is the vertical they're in, where are they located, but then most importantly, of course, is what are those IT projects that they're looking to receive funding for? And that really comes to the use case. And I touched on it just a minute ago, but in the case of education, what are the student services, whether K-12 or higher ed? What are those student services that the client is looking to deliver? Enhanced distance learning for rural students in a K-12 environment. Perhaps it's enhanced campus safety for a higher ed institution. So you got student services. In the case of state and local government, it's really around the citizen services, delivering the citizen a set of tools that they can access in the COVID world so they can do it without coming into an office. So I think we've all probably been there, but going to the DMV and getting your driver's license updated. Before all this technology was available, that was a very difficult and time-consuming process. In many cases, perhaps that still is not fully automated. So delivering citizen services like being able to update your driver's license online. That's just one example. Social security services at the local government level, community-based services. And then, of course, in the healthcare arena, patient services. And the first thing we think of here is telemedicine. Early on in the pandemic, of course, there was a real hesitation to go into a medical facility. But of course, the doctors need to continue to deliver their patient care. And so telemedicine becomes very, very important, especially in the rural communities where, there's maybe 50 or 100-mile driving distance to get in to see a doctor. So you think about patient services, citizen services, student services. That's the design point. And then after that information collection is done, that information gets submitted to our grant consultant, and then they create the funding report. And so they take all this information into account, including the use cases, and they generate a funding report. These funding reports are very detailed. I see many of them as they come through the program. Usually there's 5 or 8 grants that are identified based on the use case that the client was asking about. And so these funding reports can be 30 or 40 pages in length. The funding report really begins the consultation engagement with the grant consulting firm to drill down into that funding report that you would receive as part of the program. Answer any of the questions that the client may have about the various grants. Usually in these funding reports, each grant that is identified has 4 or 5 pages of information about it. So it can be fairly complex, and we want to make sure through our program that the clients are accessing these grant consultants, these experts, to get your client questions answered. So that begins the consulting engagement. And then from there, there's dialogue about the IT project or projects that were identified, just to make sure that the most appropriate, most likely to award grants have been identified. So the grant consultant will work with the client to go through that process, making sure they have a full understanding. Maybe there were some things that didn't come through in the information collection process that they wanted to clarify. And then ultimately, and most importantly really, is then helping the client through the application process. And this goes in a lot of different directions. So in some end user clients, there's maybe a high level of expertise, and so they just need a second set of eyes before they submit their application. But as we were talking about earlier, we know in many cases clients are challenged with resources to be able to go through this grant application process. So in our program, the grant consultant will work with the client, asking questions about their expertise. Have they ever worked through a grant application before? Do they need help in best practices in completing a grant application? Even, as I said before, reviewing Rev 1, Rev 2, Rev 3 as the client is putting the application together. The ultimate goal is a very tight grant application that aligns very well with the parameters that were set forth in the grant when it was released, at making sure all the most important things are included. And just as importantly, there's no superfluous information included that might jeopardize the grant request. And so our program starts with that information collection tool, works through the IT projects along with Anexinet, and then ultimately with the client to help the client put a successful grant application together.
Yeah, Terry, and I think that's really key to the program itself. I've been doing this a long time. I've seen a lot of people apply for different types of grants. And to your process, or to your comment earlier about how long the process takes, sometimes they'll wait, 20, 30, 40 weeks, get a response back and say, sorry, the grant's not available to you because you forgot to check this box or you didn't answer this question correctly.
Right.
So your team actually goes through the fine details of it to ensure, a larger percentage that they'll win the grant, which is fantastic.
Yeah, exactly right. We want in the program, we want to help the clients get access to these funds more quickly so they can deploy the use cases that they need to deliver to their downstream customers, whether student, citizen, or patient customer.
Right. Yeah, I've seen it time and time again where people just really don't even apply for grants anymore because it was so hectic and, so many chances of error that they weren't going to receive it. They didn't receive it. And they're like, well, this has just been a complete waste of time. I don't want to move forward with this ever again. So that is a big benefit of the program. One other thing I want to touch upon as well moving forward is connectivity. Seems to be really big moving forward into this new grant season or whatever you want to call it. But the connectivity with ISPs and SD-WAN, there seems to be a pretty big movement towards that direction, correct?
I'm glad you brought that up. I referenced the 3 stimulus packages that have been released already. And of course, if we're watching the news, we saw that the infrastructure package has been approved, should head to the president's desk in the next week or so for signature. And so we're already working to develop a roadmap for those projects that will get funded through the infrastructure package, when that gets released, probably we'll start to see funding begin to flow maybe February, March timeframe. To your point about connectivity, as one example, within this infrastructure package, I think there's $62 billion specific to broadband. And so then that's just one bucket of many from the summary that I've seen so far. So it will continue to be a very exciting landscape, with the grant funding, the federal funding. It'll continue to be a very challenging landscape, as I was describing earlier, with the overlapping timelines and qualifiers and so forth. But again, this program will help the clients, as I said, demystify what is out there currently, and then the infrastructure package. And by the way, somewhere down the road, perhaps there's an American Families Plan that Congress is still working on. We don't really have a good sense of what that ultimately will include from a technology perspective, because much of it seems to be social programs. But there may be potential for some additional technology funding when the American Families Plan gets released as well.
Excellent. Yeah, and that's really why we're so excited about the program, because many of the solutions that we provide to our clients is exactly what's going to be funded. So it is a very good, exciting program. We're very excited to be participating in it, and I think there's a lot of value we can bring to our clients. One other thing you mentioned about through the application process, there's all these technologies that can support the grants. Can they fill out more than one application, or is it just one and you move on and just kind of select what the biggest priority is for you?
No, it's as many as the client has needs for. In our role in the center of the channel in helping to enable our resellers, strategic resellers like Anexinet, and ultimately helping you to help your clients. So this program is open to as many different IT projects that would align to the stimulus, and really outside of stimulus. Our program looks at the entire funding landscape, not just the stimulus funding. So that, if there's 3 projects that you have on the docket for the coming year, then we would do 3 different funding reports, because likely they're going to be a little bit different. And so maybe there'll be different grants that align to those. So yeah, there's no limit to the number of different projects that we could go create the funding reports for, and ultimately hopefully find some grants on that.
It sounds like you guys have got you're providing a tremendous service in terms of, streamlining the process, doing the investigation for the, customers that are in the SLED space, and helping them find, grant money that they can apply for and do it more quickly so that they can actually be successful and not take this 30 to 40 weeks, all of which is very, very powerful. And I think the one gap that people might want to know about is how do they know, right? Like how do they know what projects they might have in their portfolio or on their docket, or things that have been presented to them as challenges that they need to solve? And they're like, hey, we really need to fix this stuff. Yeah. Is there grant money out there for this? Is there a way that they need to know that before coming to you or us? Or tell me how that should work. Like, how do you get the information to be successful?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dave. Again, back to that level of uncertainty. So it's hard to tell, right? If you look at some of the wording in the stimulus grants in particular, the wording is very wide and loose. So I'll paraphrase here, but funding to support the needs of addressing COVID challenges in the K-12 school district. I mean, that could be anything. Yes, it is difficult to know what might qualify for, but look, we know that there's some uncertainty there. I always suggest leverage the program and let us help you figure that out. So if you're unsure whether or not a program or a project would get funded, go through the process. Let's get the funding report. We'll get the consultant experts to pull the funding report, and then we'll find out, right? Maybe there will only be 2 grants, or the grant landscape will be a little bit more narrow for one project. But generally speaking, I've seen between 5 and 8 different grants identified for the various projects that have come through the program so far. So when in doubt, I'd say let's work through the process. Let's leverage the process and the program we've got identified to help you figure that out.
It almost sounds like you're saying, listen, if you have a technology challenge and you're in the SLED space, there's a lot of money out there. Don't sit around and feel like you're stuck because you can't find the funding that you need, or you're not sure how to find it. Call us and let us help you. It almost sounds like that's what you're saying. Did I get that right?
Yeah, the only thing I would modify to that, Dave, is that add healthcare to that, right? So we're talking SLED, but in our program, healthcare entities are also included. So yes, We want to energize and activate this program for the client community, and with the help of Anexinet, getting that done and getting it out on the street.
Well, as a taxpayer, I got to tell you that I'm all about trying to help SLED wherever we can. I mean, if there's money out there that the government's giving people to improve, programs and, technology in their space, whether it's, healthcare or SLED or whatever, I think I'd love to have my tax dollars help out. So that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in this market, whether SLED or healthcare, it's really a service to the community, right? That's the goal of the client base, that they're serving citizens or students or patients. And so we know that is their mission, and our mission is to help them be successful in their mission.
And David, just to follow up with that, Terry, one thing that you are leaving out, I've had the benefit to work with the team on the grants, is that you have specific individuals that are working the different types of verticals, correct? You have a healthcare practice, you have a K through 12 practice, you have a state and local practice, a higher education practice. So they have already seen several of these grants that have been applied for and the technologies that are being applied and approved, correct?
Yeah, totally correct, Terry. There are experts in each of these verticals and others that you didn't mention. So like tribal, there's a fair amount of funding in tribal communities or for tribal communities. Transportation is another one. But yeah, our grant consultants are experts with 20 plus years of experience in these niche verticals. And so they're not, a jack of all trades. They are specialists when it comes to local government or public safety or K-12 and so forth.
Excellent. So we'll be able to get our clients on with those specific, details, and they'll be able to go through what solutions others have put in place and solutions that are available out there, correct?
Yeah, I mean, part of this consulting engagement really is to help open the aperture first of what is possible and what is available, and then to drill down into the specifics that the client is looking to solve for, to make sure that those 1, 2, or 3 grants that align most likely to that project get identified and the application can get submitted.
So one thing that I know I have leveraged the program with is cybersecurity. And I know that's a very general term, Dave, but one thing that has really gained a lot of funding and a lot of attention through the grants program is setting up DR specific to cybersecurity. Are you seeing the same thing, Dave?
Yeah, you're 100% right. So cyber insurance has most definitely doubled, tripled in some cases. The underwriters are actually going back to their brokers or to their customers directly, and they're giving them, PowerPoint slides or documents and saying, hey, you've got to go do these minimum things, this minimum list of requirements in order to even re-up your policy for the coming year. Oh yeah, and by the way, hey, your premiums are probably going to go up as well. Some of them are doing that. And the things that are on that list are usually disaster recovery, security awareness training, email security, perimeter firewalls at all of the primary, locations where there is some kind of data. So we are seeing that a lot. I will say that they're using kind of a blanket approach. As you said, cybersecurity is not really the general term. Data security is actually the more general term. Cybersecurity is very much limited to what we all use on a daily basis when you work in a technology field. It's about what's on your computer, what's on your server, what's in your database, things of that nature, and then what can, needs to be done to protect that information. These insurance companies are taking a very broad brush to the concept of security and cybersecurity, and they're not really using a risk-based approach for every customer. They try to ask some probing questions about do you have a website? What's on the website? Is there some sort of, regulatory or compliance related information like PII, personally identifiable information, or personal health information? But it's not really a risk-based approach the way we do it in the field on the ground every day, right? Where we actually analyze the environment. We look at where the data sits, how much of it has, is it encrypted from, point A to point B, some for example, in payment card information, PCI, all the way from the source to the processor. They're just kind of saying you have to go do these things. And some of those things that they're asking you to do, depending on the size of your organization or your company, can be prohibitive, right? You can't just come up with money all of a sudden to do these massive implementations or buy, 500 firewalls or whatever the case might be. So I will say those are good areas to contact us and help actually take a more industry standard risk-based approach. And we can help you really establish all right, here's your risk profile based on what you have in the environment today, what kind of data you have, and then what you really need to do. And we've been successful at having those conversations with underwriters and insurance companies to say, listen, I understand your mandate. I understand what you're trying to do, but we've actually gone the extra step and assessed ourselves if you're the customer, or we've helped the customer assess themselves. And here's our risk profile. And so here's what we're going to do. And so in order for us to be able to do business together and you to, insure us, this is a more reasonable conversation, and kind of paring that list back down. That's what we've been working on, I would say, over the past 18, 20 months.
No surprise with cybersecurity. I saw a recent set of data. So if you're familiar with NASCIO, which is National Association of State CIOs, cybersecurity has been number one on our list for the last 5 years as far as priorities. And we saw with COVID all the challenges with ransomware in K-12 amongst other verticals. So tying that to this whole backup recovery idea, who would have thought that long in the tooth backup recovery solutions would have, the importance to, not only be able to get you back into business, which was the original story, right? That minimize downtime, but then enhance the position to prevent or at least to minimize ransomware. And now on top of that, maybe it reduces a client's cyber insurance policy costs because they can show they've got a robust backup and recovery solution in place. So the days of the tired, boring backup DR solution is long gone, and it has many, many benefits protecting against ransomware and things like cyber insurance costs.
And I was just going to add on to that as well, Dave. What we're seeing, last year, we saw a mandate from the state that all state agencies had to have some form of MFA in place. And really that led into a lot of discussions with our customer, because there's obviously a variety of products out there that can support that. But it really bled down into phishing attacks, it bled down into security policies. And these are all things that we can provide our clients at Anexinet, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the minimum table stakes for cyber hygiene or cybersecurity hygiene, right? What you do to keep your house clean have really come up a long way. It's not good enough to have rotating passwords anymore, right? The pendulum has swung full shift into don't rotate your passwords, use good, strong passwords or passphrases that are, you can remember, but they're not something that would be easy for somebody to be able to guess. But we have to secure things with MFA because passwords and the amount of processing and computing power that's now available, it's so easy to crack a password. Passwords just don't work anymore. They're not good enough. So multi-factor authentication is a requirement. Being able to maintain some kind of secure perimeter around crucial, data systems, right? Think about Medicaid and Medicare, right? And state governments and local agencies that have to be able to communicate with MMIS to, be able to, or NCMS, for, to determine whether people are eligible and what their eligibility requirements are. There's a lot of federal tax information, FTI data, that is usually involved in that process, and a ton of private health information, obviously. That's our wheelhouse, right? But analyzing, we have a full stack security services solutions group where we're trying to either build your program from the ground up and put that baseline cyber hygiene in place, or mature your program, regardless of where you are on the roller coaster, and mature that program to the next stage. So if you're in the middle, we're helping you out with things like risk assessments and vulnerability management, trying to move to a passwordless type solution where, or just-in-time access. And then on the farther end of things, we're doing some really cool stuff around security automation. So like automated response capability based on, normal telemetry that comes out of an environment for monitoring and logging, to be able to take responses and shut down ports or disable credentials, or take programmatic action in a 24/7, 365 basis, because regardless of whether your business is 9 to 5 or 24/7, your computer systems don't sleep, right? And nowadays with these new attack patterns, it's not good enough just to have a human intervene when they finally see it. You really need your machines to be protecting you 24/7. And high-speed encryptors and PKI infrastructure, private key and public key infrastructure, using certificates so you have multiple realms of authentication. We're doing a lot of really cool things in that space right now. So we really run the gambit, to answer your question, Terry.
I knew I made a bit of a mistake asking the smart guy a simple question, but
sorry, my bad. I get really passionate about this stuff. Sorry.
No, I'm just teasing you. No, it's fantastic information. And then I'm going to open up a little bit more of a can of worms there, because one thing that we're seeing the grants funding, we talked about connectivity, but also the move to the cloud. I've had a couple of healthcares that, received a pretty sizable amount of money to start bouncing their applications, some of their data and everything into the cloud. The biggest fear with moving things to the cloud, one is the speed, but the security of it all. Is that something that we also assist our clients with?
Yeah, these are all very, very common requests, even if it's just a request for information or a request for service. These are definitely things that are increasing in intensity when it comes to the things that we're hearing out in the field. Terry, the one question I would have for you is to tie this to the program a little bit more specifically. Like, how many of these things would apply for funding? Like if a customer came and said, we really don't have a good understanding of our cyber footprint and our security, if it's good enough, if it needs to be updated. That might include things like consultative services just to understand process and policy. That might include additions to or upgrades to network infrastructure, hardware, things like that. And it might include things like cloud services, building a hybrid environment, migrating into one cloud or another, or things like that. Is there anything on that list that rings out as either an automatic inclusion or an automatic exclusion in terms of getting funding from these grant programs?
So a couple things here. Back to Terry N's question about cloud. We certainly see a lot of activity in cloud, continue to see movement to cloud. So typically, whether healthcare or otherwise, the first systems of engagement are the first systems that move to the cloud. So whether it's a student or a patient or a citizen, those engagement services move to the cloud. And then systems of record, so the back office, sales data or, customer information usually lag a little bit moving to the cloud. But within the grants landscape, whether it's a technology like moving applications to the cloud so that a citizen or a patient or a student can access those services, I would believe would definitely qualify. When it comes to like cybersecurity, as an example, there are a few. Well, let me back up. In the case of stimulus grants, the way they're handling cyber is they don't necessarily call out cyber, but they're saying, hey, what technology do you need to deliver patient services or citizen services? There's inherent cyber needs in any of those kinds of applications, any of those use case deployments. And so although cyber is not generally called out in the stimulus funding, it's inherent in the projects and they would be funded. Outside of the stimulus grants, again, our program looks at the entire grant landscape. So when you come to us and through the program with a use case that you're looking for funding for, the program and our consultants will look at the entire grant landscape, again, stimulus related and not stimulus related. And those not stimulus or traditional grants, there are specific grants associated with cybersecurity. So it's a qualified yes, Chris, but I again, back to what we were saying earlier, I would encourage come through. When in doubt, come through the program. Let's leverage the program and figure out what is available.
Yeah, I like that answer because it answers the question that I probably should have asked, which is, a company knows that they're in the SLED space and they know that they have some needs. Their best step is to approach the program with their goals and see what can be possibly applied. It gets them experienced people who know the landscape of just creating the grants, but it also gets them a company with experience and knows what grants are going to be useful rather than them having to do all that research on their own.
One of the things we're up against is the fear of the unknown, right? And so nothing gets done. I heard anecdotally, or have heard anecdotally, that in some of the clients, they're not allowed to spend their allocated IT budget until they can prove that they've gone and exhausted all the grant funding. And so I don't know if that's across the board, but that's certainly something that the IT directors are looking at. Look, I don't want to issue this budget that we've got on the sidelines until we know that we've exhausted the grant funding. And again, let us help you get through that part of it, figure that grant landscape out. Who knows? Maybe this program will create a couple of heroes at the client because they've won significant grant awards through the program. So we're hoping that that's the outcome in many cases.
I know sometimes the government can be pretty stringent on how money's being spent to prevent things like fraud, waste, and abuse. Are you seeing that as a challenge for customers at all that have been successful through the program, or just about financial reporting? Is there any hardships in that line, or do you feel like that's pretty negligible?
Yeah, it's a great question, David. And in many of the grants, there is going to be some reporting requirement. Now, I'm not the expert. That's why we have our grant experts on the program. I would say that the client should expect some level of reporting requirement, especially in the case of the grants that are 100%, right? Some of these grants are like an 80-20 match, 80% grant, 20% match from the client. But there is variability certainly in the reporting requirement. So you should definitely be prepared and be looking at that up front. And by the way, early on in the process of engagement with the consultant team, we can ask that question. As we drill down into the project and we've got those grants identified, part of the build out should be and would be, what is the reporting requirements on behalf of the client when they receive the funds, so they're aware of what that requirement is and they're planning for it. But I don't think it's overly burdensome, but in many of the grants there is some reporting requirement.
Okay, so it's there, but we make sure that we present it up front. Everybody knows what they're walking into, and it's manageable in most cases. Sounds like
yes, that sounds about right.
All right, that's good.
What about grants or grant programs that are already in place? Can the grant program that we're talking about through Tech Data help with getting either a renewal or an extension or anything like that about grants that might already exist?
Chris, I should have known you were going to come in with a question that I did not have an answer to. I'm not the grant expert. I'm not sure, but let's find out, right? If we're working with the client and helping to identify a grant, let's bring that up on the table. Hey, we applied last year for XYZ grant and were awarded, and we're looking for year 2 extensions. It'll be a question we'd have to get answered from the experts.
From what I've heard so far, it feels like that's the biggest takeaway is if you don't know, ask. We have experts that can help figure out whether or not we can get the funding for your specific use case or not. And the worst case scenario is unfortunately we can't, but in a lot of cases, it sounds like we can.
You beat me by 1 second. I was just going to say that.
Yeah, and to clarify, it all starts with that engagement between Anexinet and the client, uncovering, as you normally guys do in your project consultation, identifying those use cases, completing that short information collection phase that leads to the funding report. That's really the first step in this consulting engagement that gets all these questions addressed.
Well, one thing to add to that, Chris, and kind of put it into a real case scenario is we were working with a healthcare facility that was actually implementing a security platform. And what we ended up finding out that is to authenticate through things that they needed to upgrade all of their switches. They also needed to upgrade some of their wireless access points. So we actually went back to the grants team, added those in, and sure enough, we received funding not only for the security platform, but also to do a complete switch refresh from their LAN all the way to their core. So there are funds available out there to support these projects. And then another client wanting to move applications to the cloud and realized, hey, we need to ramp up some of our core switching, some of our LAN switching, and it tied right into that as well. So when we're applying for these grants, there's a lot of hardware that can be pulled through that a lot of these organizations just haven't had the funds to upgrade in several years. And when I say several, I'm talking, 5 to 10 years. Mm-hmm. So same goes with servers. We saw an abundance of servers and we're able to upgrade as well. So to that point, again, that Terry is kind of hammering over and over again, list the projects that you have available that are out there, and let's just see if there's funding there for them, because more than likely there is.
That and security is really in everything, right? If we live in an ever more connected world. COVID has only made that worse, right? We have a vastly larger remote workforce across the entire world than we ever have in the past. And, you can't do things nowadays and run an effective business where you have data, and bottom line, we all have data, and we just can't do that if we're going to be connected and be secure at the same time without doing some alterations. And, you can't, and having legacy infrastructure or, legacy systems is, probably one of the premier ways to walk yourself into an attack that is going to have some sort of negative impact on your business.
Absolutely. The other thing too is just what we're seeing a little bit of funding for as well with some of these processes that we're putting in is business process automation, something that Anexinet does extremely well. And Dave, you know very well that, hey, if you got 500 servers, 1,000 servers, you forget to patch one, that's the one that they attack and they leave open, right? So, it's nice that we can come in and automate those services, give you a full report of what's been, upgraded and updated, and know that you are compliant. I think it helps a lot of people sleep at night when we can actually put those processes in place. It's automated, and 100% that everything's been taken care of.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. The number one question and area in almost every risk assessment or even security framework assessment that you take is usually around asset management. And they want to know, how are you doing programmatic asset discovery? Or, if you're small enough and you can keep everything on a spreadsheet because it's manageable, that's fine. But, they need to know that there's a process wrapped around that and that you're controlling those assets in some kind of way. And because everything else spins off of that, knowing what you have and knowing where you have it, and then what condition it's in, and then what processes you've wrapped around it to control that asset. So that's been our talking point, right? We need to be able to know what you have, where you have it. We can help you do that. And then once you know what you have and where it is, we can look at the telemetry of the device that comes from it, things going in and out of it, right? The signals, whether they're in, whether they're out, and what's happening to them, but then also the condition of the device. And then, knowing what you have and where you have it enables us to look for patterns. And once you can establish a pattern, a recognizable pattern, which isn't hard to do, you can build in automation and say, okay, when this condition occurs, I want you to go do stuff. I want you to make sure that this device is patched. If it doesn't get patched, I want you to send a red flag, and people need to freak out because it's a critical system or it's a non-critical system. So nobody needs to freak out. Submitting forms even, right? I mean, business process automation, robotic process automation doesn't necessarily have to be just around infrastructure and servers and systems and patching. It can also be just things like forms. We're submitting forms and it takes 700 hours for people to go through and click these buttons in these forms based on a certain set of conditions. Well, why are we having people do that? We can make the machine go and do that on the back end based off the criteria and the conditions that are set where that checkbox needs to be checked. And it can be a validation step in the process to make sure that you have better business outcomes. Pick a topic, but yeah, it's all the world is the oyster, right? And we can make computers smarter, and that's really the goal at the end of the day, is to make them smarter, make them better, and make them perform better business operations than we've done yesterday.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And we've seen that in place. I mean, exactly what you talked about. It could be an employee's full-time job, 2 or 3 of them, but probably really it needs to be 5 or 6 or 10 of them. And I know when we've gone in with our RPA and our automation services, we uncovered a lot that is not actually being accomplished and, being done correctly. And also what we've seen is a reduction of people that, obviously need to be doing something else with their time. So reducing that time spent, to your point, of automating those services and freeing up their time and letting them do what they need to do on a day-to-day basis. So I've seen a huge explosion in the automation world, that's for sure.
Well, let me give you a use case. I mean, this is one of those stories I tell because it excites me. And I think especially people in the SLED space, right, where they still today have a lot of people contacting them for whatever reason, right? They're people calling on the phone, or they're contacting them through chat services that are on their website or whatever. But imagine the power of being able to have someone just talk to you either over a chat or on the phone. And rather than you as the recipient of the phone call working in the business that needs to take down this information, and instead of trying to type on a keyboard or record the call and then go back and take some sort of action after the fact, imagine how many more phone calls or how much more relaxed you would be if we just let the computer process the person who called, and you ask a set number of questions, and we teach the computer what those questions are, and then to listen for the responses and use natural language processing to fill out all the forms and do some validation checks, or even pop up a little window on the screen to say, hey, ask that question again. That was a little bit unclear. I didn't get that answer. And then, then the form and the document or the request or the service ticket or whatever it is just runs through its life cycle. I mean, you as the call center advocate, your life would be so much easier. And that is completely and totally possible and doable in today's day and age. And people are doing it. So let us help you, right? I mean, that is some powerful stuff just in that one use case. But it really gets me excited to think about the things that we can do around, phone calls and natural language processing and just, business process automation.
Even on the outside, but more on the inside. So a lot of these, zoning is a specific thing. And I didn't really realize it until starting to talk to a handful of our customers. But with zoning, you have 3 or 4 different departments that actually have to touch that application if somebody is wanting to build something. And that process can, take 4 to, 6 to 8 to 12 weeks. And that's really just due to people having to go through the process. And that's something that we can automate and, really reduce down to 3 or 4 days. And then the human error is really what causes the length of the process. So eliminating that human error can be done basically through automation of what you're discussing. So it's been an exciting process. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of automation in state and local government is just police and fire, right? Just a simple ticket. They have the ability to put everything down on an iPad, hit a hotspot, and then upload it. But from there, it has to touch 3 or 4 different types of organizations through billing, through court systems, through, jails and things of that nature. So being able to automate that process definitely has, one, saved a ton of time, but also a ton of resources for the state and local government. So there's some exciting things that, thinking outside the box that we can actually help organizations with.
I'll just echo real quickly that RPA and the zoning example. Just think of COVID last year, all the people that were adding additions to homes and so forth over the last 20 months. Having an RPA solution that knocks down that time from application to a contractor being able to show up on site. I mean, that's huge. But in closing, I guess I would leave you with the idea that I said earlier, the client, you have a mission to serve your customers, your patients, your students, your citizens. And we're here, and our mission is to help enable you to be more successful at that. So when in doubt, leverage this program that we have available with Anexinet and let us help you find the money that you need to go fund those projects.
All right, that sounds good. Terry, Dave, Terry, thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris.
My pleasure.
All right, take care. Bye.
Sure.